Welcome to Common Sense Care, Parenting Gender-Confused Kids with Truth and Love, brought to you by Partners for Ethical Care. So-called affirmative care is the gender industry's one-size-fits-all answer for any and all children who struggle with their identity. In no other area of medicine, psychology, or education is one treatment plan assigned to every person. At Partners for Ethical Care, we believe that each child is an individual and should be given the care and support that's most appropriate for him or her. So welcome back. I'm Maria Keffler.
And I'm Erin Brewer. And what is our topic for today?
Today, we are talking about the cultic aspects of gender ideology, how this is really a cult we're looking at.
Yeah, and some people might bristle at that. That's a pretty loaded term, cult, and yet it's very clearly defined. It has meaning, and 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 I think when we go through sort of what is the definition of a cult, what makes something, a religion, a belief, or a cult, I think people will really understand why we're saying that. And what is the reason for sort of defining it as a cult?
Well, as you look at the things that the gender industry is telling people and is expecting, it really is very ideological. And I've said this for a while, and a woman in my school district who is a mom of a transgender identified child got really angry with me for calling it an ideology because she said it's a fact. This is truth. It is fact. It is not an ideology. And that really got me thinking, well, why am I calling it an ideology?
Mhm.
And I started looking at what a cult is. And a cult is a group of people who rally around a certain set of beliefs that have to do with the meaning of life, the origins of life. There's a little bit of gray area between what you call a religion and what you call a cult. Religion is around an idea of a deity, of the origins of life, how we got here, what's the meaning of life. And there are many religions, and those are not necessarily cults, they're belief systems. It falls into the area of a cult when it departs from fact and when it typically a cult will revolve around one charismatic leader who drives it and to whom you must have complete and total devotion. I will start by saying that's one of the aspects of the gender ideology that is lacking in terms of a cult, is that I haven't been able to find like who is that one charismatic leader. But I've been reading, and as I'm reading about cults and thinking about this, I think it is the self. I think that charismatic leader to whom you must have complete devotion is actually your own sense of self, because that's what's driving this sense or this idea that what you are inside may not match what you are outside. Your inner sense of self may not match your physiology or biology. And we have to listen to that inner sense of self no matter what it's saying. And there's so much that is nonsensical about it, that's contradictory about it. We've talked about that in our last video about why gender ideology is so illogical. Um, but we're not allowed to question anything that an individual person says about his or her inner landscape, inner workings. And that's a big part of identifying it as a cult, is you're not allowed to question it. Not allowed to say, well, why do you think that? How did you begin thinking that? Let's look at the logic of that. As soon as you question anything that somebody thinks about themselves, you're labeled a hater, a bigot, a transphobe. And that leads to another aspect of cult ideology. All cults have an in-group and an out-group. The in-group are the chosen, the true believers, the righteous people, and the people on the outside of the cult are to be suspect. They are to be cut out of your life if they don't believe what you believe. They are called lots of names. And so that's another reason when I look at this, I'm like, oh, this is very cultic.
Well, and I think it's a really important lens to look at this through because even if it doesn't completely fit all of the definition of cult, like having a charismatic leader, it is so similar to a cult in how the belief system, how the people are indoctrinated with such a belief system that they really start accepting things that are clearly nonsensical, as you said. And so for parents who are struggling with children who have bought into this ideology, I think that it can be really helpful to understand how cults work and how to get somebody out of a cult. Because if you just assume this is a phase that your kid's going through, and they'll outgrow it, it's to the point now where it used to be that children would outgrow gender dysphoric feelings, that the vast majority of kids would sort of resolve that as they went through puberty. This is really different. This isn't gender dysphoria. This isn't typical body dysmorphia. This is a belief system that they're being indoctrinated into, and they're not going to just simply be able to come out, grow out of it. One of the things that I'm seeing over and over and over again in groups for desisters and detransitioners is this sense of like, I'm trying so hard. I'm trying so hard to detransition. I just don't know if I can. Or when somebody does detransition, there's this like, wow, I don't know how you did that. That's so hard. And so even people who are trying to get out of it are struggling to get out of it. And that's what's so different between sort of a normal kind of destructive phase that can happen to teenagers versus really being indoctrinated into a cultish belief system, that the kids, even when they want to get out of it, sometimes have a hard time. And as parents, we have to know what are the techniques that professionals use to get people out of cults so that we can apply them in this situation.
Yeah. This is a book I want to recommend to everybody, if I can get this so everybody can see it. I've been reading this. It's Freedom of Mind by Stephen Hassan. He is a cult expert. He was sucked into the Moonies cult back in the 70s, and his family staged an intervention and got him out. And he has since studied psychology, and he has started the Freedom of Mind Center. And so I've been reading this book and sort of looking at it through the lens of the transgenderism movement. And so I'm going to refer to that a lot today as we talk. And we're going to have that in the resources at the bottom of the video. I really recommend this book. But he talks about the importance of a strategic interaction approach. SIA, he calls it strategic interaction approach. And when I talk to people who have gotten their kids back, by and large, they have done this, whether they realized they were doing it or not. But one of the first things that they did was to cut their kids off from all of the influences of transgender ideology. The younger your child is, the easier that is to do. It's never easy. With a young child, it's pulling them out of school, it's taking away the internet, it's severing them from the influencers around them who are like carrying them along in this ideology. Unfortunately, with older kids, if they're over 18 and they're on their own, it's much, much harder to do. But he talks about that, Stephen Hassan talks about that with some of the more understood cults like the Moonies or the Om Shinrikyo in Japan or Scientology, that adults have the freedom to belong to whatever group they want. But the first thing to do, and we've talked about this, is to try to keep connection with your child by trying to have activities, things you do together that don't have anything to do with this ideology. Just, hey, would you come over to dinner? We miss you. We'd love to see you. Trying to maintain a relationship, keep that relationship, and to have strategic interactions, sort of planned discussions. The person who's in the cult is not going to know that these are planned, but you sort of have an agenda that I'm going to ask questions like, well, okay, so tell me more about gender. Like, okay, is it fixed or is it fluid? How does that work? And ask those questions and try to just keep a little at a time chiseling away at the lack of logic in it. because they have been taught, cult members have been taught to stop thoughts, how to, if they're questioned about something that the ideology believes, they're given techniques to stop their thoughts so that they don't go there. And with gender ideology, those terms that they throw out, you're a hater, you're a bigot, you're a transphobe, those are thought stopping techniques. As soon as someone hears a question like, is gender fixed or is it fluid? You're a transphobe for even asking that. That stops the thought. And so your job as a parent or as someone who loves this person is to try to keep pushing them back toward thinking. It's tough, though. It's really
That is
tough.
so interesting. So you kind of want to re-engage those critical thinking skills.
Hmm.
Wow.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
one of the things that I want to clarify here, because I've heard people say that all religions are cults, and so what I want to clarify here is one of the reasons that cults are dangerous is, first of all, they encourage that isolating behavior, as you mentioned, that you're not allowed to be around anybody who doesn't agree with you. It's that kind of thought control, because if you're around people who don't agree with you, you might start thinking, and that's dangerous for cults because they're based on a really shaky foundation of nonsense, basically. The other thing that's so critical about this particular cult and most cults is that they embrace self-harming behaviors. And to me, that is the most important aspect of this for parents, is that if you don't stop this, if this isn't stopped, and I shouldn't put all the responsibility on parents, because this is not something, sometimes parents can't stop it. But if the child continues in this cult for very long, they're going to start wanting to engage in self-harming behaviors, taking puberty blockers, cross-sex hormones, surgeries, all of these things that are going to damage their healthy bodies. And that's not something that most religions advocate. I know of very few mainstream religion. I don't, maybe none, that advocate self-harming behavior. We've got a perfectly healthy body and they want you to damage it, often medicalizing for life. And that's such a critical difference. And like you said, most of it's based on a lack of critical thinking skills. They're taught not to question. They're taught just to go along with the ideology, and they're taught that anybody who encourages critical thinking about this is actually evil, bad, somebody that you shouldn't be around. And so that's where the parents have to do this very careful dance, because if they push it too hard, the child might completely disengage with them.
Mhm.
And so you mentioned having these events set up where you're able to kind of question. But again, I want to caution people not to push too hard, because the child might completely disengage with you, and then you lose all opportunity to help them out of this.
Yeah, yeah. Um, Stephen Hassan in this book talks about his organization, which comes alongside families and helps them pull people out of cults.
Mhm.
And it is it is a dance, and knowing how far to push and when to relent is really a sensitive, nuanced thing, and it's really tough. One other thing I wanted to make a point. I loved what you said about the difference between a religion and a cult. I didn't appreciate this until I read Stephen Hassan's book.
Mhm.
What cults do is they change your identity.
Mhm.
So you have your pre cult identity, and then the cult reforms you into the identity they want you to have. And when I read that in his book, that's when I said, oh my gosh, identity. That's what transgenderism is all about. It's about your identity. And anyone who's seen kids who go through this, they are very different once they enter the transgender cult. Their appearance, their speech, their thought process, and they have this new identity.
Mhm.
And so helping somebody out of the cult is really helping them reconnect with their true identity.
The pre-cult identity.
Yeah. Well, they're pre-cult, but this is also what's so insidious when it's happening with middle school kids and young kids going through adolescence, is they are starting to form their adult identity. And getting derailed by this false identity, this transgenderism ideology, it derails a natural process of maturation. And so they're supposed to be forming their true adult identity and figuring out who they are as adults. And then they get derailed by this nonsensical, dangerous, harmful cult. And so you're not necessarily just trying to help them get back to their pre-cult identity, because that may have been their childhood identity. Who are you really? You know, your biology is integral to who you are, and you need to come into a place of accepting who you are, not rejecting it for some fake identity.
You know, it's really interesting that you say that, because that encouraging children to almost remain childlike, with the puberty blockers especially, but that you know, one of the hallmarks of adolescence is questioning. It's sort of like, you know, the toddlers ask things like, why is the sky blue, and why is the grass green? They ask these kind of, you know, basic questions. Then teenagers sort of go through the same process, only they're asking more, you know, these broad-based questions. Why am I here? Who am I? What do I want to do with my life? These are really big and difficult questions and can be overwhelming to kids. And so in a way, the trans cult just says, don't worry, you don't have to think about that. And it provides them with scripts, and it provides them with this way to sort of damp down those difficult questions that they're asking themselves. So it really does, there's an attempt to keep them almost childlike and also unquestioning. And it reminds me a lot of, I went to a meeting once when I was, you know, maybe a young teenager, and they were saying some stuff, and I started asking questions, and they actually asked me to leave. And I thought that was really interesting. That right there is sort of an indication, if you're not allowed to question things, if members within that community are so defensive that they immediately just call you a hater if you start questioning, that's a good sign something's off. Because for most ideologies that people have, you know, they welcome questioning. You know, I'm firm in my belief system. Come on, bring it on. Ask me questions. This is just the opposite. This is, you are not allowed to ask questions. And if you do, it's because you're a hater, a bigot, perhaps even a Nazi and a fascist.
Yeah, well, that's evidence of the thought stopping techniques, because you're right. If you have the facts and you have something underpinning what you believe, you shouldn't be afraid of questions about it. You should be able to answer questions. I talk to a lot of parents who are in various parenting groups online, and I hear some horrific stories about these parenting groups that are supposedly support groups for parents with transgender kids. And if a parent says, you know, this doesn't make sense to me, my child is actually, you know, had trauma when she was a child, and I think this is related to that, they get raked over the coals. They just get shut down and sometimes kicked out of the group just for asking those questions. And that's a huge red flag.
Well, Maria, we have a video. I'm wondering if we can watch it, because I think it shows something that people may not realize, is that this indoctrination isn't just happening sort of within the peer groups. It's actually starting to happen within the schools. Teachers have bought into this ideology and are now pushing it onto kids, pretty young kids in the school. And this video really shows how insidious this is. And I think it's important for people. I mean, when you say pull your child out of school, a lot of people are going to be like, well, that's kind of extreme. Why would you do this? I think this video will really illustrate why that's important.
Hi, I'm Nadine, a sex educator.
And I'm Eva, a sex researcher.
I use the pronouns she and her because I'm a woman, and when I was your age, I used to be a girl.
Gender is how you feel on the inside about whether you're a boy or a girl, a man or a woman. If you're non-binary, feel like neither or both. People can also be fluid, feel more like female, more like male, based on a different day or time. It's really individual.
Absolutely.
Everyone born with a vulva is a girl. True or false?
Or identifies as a girl. Well, not everybody is sure, and that makes sense. But our genitals actually don't determine our gender. So some people born with vulvas can be boys.
I have been through the spectrum, if we were to say a spectrum of like boys and girls, I have been everywhere in between. I was born a girl, and then when I was 2 years old, I told my mom for the first time that I was a boy. And I think that I framed it, I don't remember it, I've only been told stories, but I framed it because my brother's middle name was the same as my dad's. And so I insisted that my middle name was also the same as his. But back in the day, there was no talk shows and there was no internet, there was no resources. So she just ignored it. And then nothing happened for many, many years. And then it still took me a long time into my 20s before I decided to transition. But in there, I was a tomboy, if that's what we say, or like I was sporty, I had short hair.
Look at how exploitative this is, or look at all the advocacy here. This isn't just presenting some facts to children. It's not presenting any facts to children, it's presenting fantasy. But the suggestion here is, look, I was a tomboy. Maybe if you're a tomboy, you're actually the opposite sex. Yeah, I had short hair. Maybe if you've got short hair, maybe you're the opposite sex. It's horrifying. I mean, it's horrifying to subject children to this kind of sexual confusion at such a young age, to subject them to such a bizarre, radical new ideology that has no basis in science, and it's only been around for a few years.
Well, Maria, I am just shocked. As I was telling you before we started to record, I didn't really know what a vulva was until a couple years ago. It was just not part of my vocabulary. And when I see little kids being told that someone who has a vulva may or may not be a woman or a female or a girl, when I hear this kind of nonsense, very concerning, not truthful stuff being taught in the schools, it shakes me to my toes. Like it's no different than a teacher going in and saying, well, kids, I know that some people think 1 + 1 is 2, but sometimes 1 + 1 is 0, and sometimes it's 3. And we really just don't know until we ask the person who's answering the question whether 1 + 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4. Maybe it's 2000. So that's really what this looks like to me. They're taking something that's biological, that's been defined, for eons. What is a male? What is a female? That's empirical, that can be tested, and they're basically confusing children at a very young age.
Yeah, and it's very intentional. And this is the thing I have the hardest time getting people to understand when I talk to them about this. So many people don't believe this is happening in their school. I think it's happening in most schools, and if it's not in your school yet, it's coming, because this is a very intentional agenda. The NEA, the National Education Association, is very clear that they want this taught in schools. And I've mentioned this before in my own district in an elementary school in February of 2019. The NEA brought a transgender activist into the school and read the book I Am Jazz to 2 classes of kindergartners. This is intentional. That if you don't know, I Am Jazz is a storybook about a boy who decided he was a girl and
Sort of decided, it seems more like parents decided
yeah.
at a very young age. And so one of the things that you have here is some entry points on how cults sort of gain access to those who are vulnerable. And I think that that's really important, because it used to be, like the Moonies might accost you in an airport and try and send you the message, or when you were walking down the street. We now have this cult that is fully ensconced within schools. And can you talk about the various ways in which cults sort of gain entry to children?
Yeah, there's sort of 2 aspects to this. The slide that we have here on entry points, I found this on genderspectrum.org, and it was in their toolkit for how to get transgender ideology into schools. This was not even about indoctrinating kids. This was about getting it into the school system. Now, this has since been removed from their page, but I grabbed screenshots before they took it down. They had 4 stages of getting this into schools and into the culture, but this was specifically about schools. The first was the internal entry point, which was changing the way people think. Make transgenderism seem like it's kind, like it's nice, like it's agreeable. And so changing people's thought patterns. The second one was interpersonal, which is really about changing the way we talk about it. And we've seen this assault on the language. No longer is it men and transgender men. Now it's men and cis men, women or trans women and cis women. And there's so many words that have never existed before, all gender fluid,
non-binary.
Yeah.
And the cis is really, I think, something that just is shocking to me, how it has infiltrated into the culture so easily. And yet basically what cis is, the term cis, for those who don't know it, cis applies to, they say it's anybody who identifies as the sex they were born. And so first of all, it suggests that anybody who's not transgender is 100% comfortable with being whatever sex they're born, whatever that means. But it also suggests that there are different categories of being male and female. So you have the cis woman and the trans woman. And I've actually even seen posts where people say, like, trans women are more of a woman than cis women because they've had to work for it. So there's this whole like muddling of our language. So now we don't have women. There's no such thing as just a woman. You're either a trans woman or a cis woman. And again, the transgender people are trying to define even what it means to be a woman. And so it's very convoluted, but I think that those kind of words that I've even seen them appear in, very, very reputable research journals. There's just sort of this acceptance, and it's sort of just taken over. And now if you say, well, I don't identify as cisgender or transgender, I'm a woman, that's now considered transphobic.
You're immediately called a transphobe and a hater because of the thought stopping process. Yeah. Right. So that was the second entry point, is changing the way people talk about this issue. The third one was instructional, and that was getting transgender curriculum into the schools. So organizations like Planned Parenthood and the Human Rights Campaign Foundation, they have created materials, and they make these beautifully packaged curriculum packages for teachers. And it's how to get transgender ideology into the math class, how to get it into the science class, how to get it into social studies and history. And I was a teacher, and teachers are overworked. We have too much to do. We're exhausted. Lesson planning, to plan a lesson for a 45-minute class can take you 3 hours sometimes if you're really doing a good job at it. And when someone comes along and says, here, I have a lesson plan all packaged for you. It's beautiful. Here's all of the worksheets. Here's all the slides. Here's some manipulatives you can use with it. Teachers are like, oh, you just saved me 3 hours. Thank you. But the intention is to get this cult into every class, and they've done it. And the fourth entry point was institutional, and that's getting the policies changed. And that's where I first encountered this whole issue, was finding out that my school district was putting into place a transgender students policy that was allowing boys to be in the girls' bathroom, boys to sleep in girls' hotel rooms overnight, boys to play on girls' sports teams. And when I saw that, and I started investigating where this came from, I realized we are behind the curve. They've already passed through all three of the first three entry points, and now they're in the fourth entry point, which is making it institutionalized. And this is what we see with the so-called Equality Act. Once they replace the word sex with gender, as you said, there is no longer a category of woman. That's a whole separate issue, but it's part and parcel of the cult ideology that we will have it our way, and everybody is going to come along with it, whether they like it or not.
What's shocking to me is how strategic this has been. Most of us who are looking at it now are like, how did we get here? We're just confused as to how this has become so accepted, almost canonical. We're not allowed to question it. And we can't figure it out. And based on this, they've had a clear strategy to do this, and they've been working on it for quite a while. So we're sort of behind the curve on this. And that's why we're at such a disadvantage, and why, just talking to your kid about it and trying to, give them an alternative may not work, because it's already so entrenched in the schools. And another slide that you have that I think is really important talks about the cult indoctrination techniques. And for those who might be questioning, like, oh, I don't know, it seems a little extreme to call this a cult. Would you mind kind of going through that slide and talking about, why it is that we should be approaching this as a cult rather than just as a different belief system?
Yeah, if you look at how this is impacting kids, what the schools are doing to kids, it's really clear to see the indoctrination that's going on. They're teaching kids younger and younger that this is factual when it is not. GSA clubs, gender sexuality allies, or what's the other term for it? Sometimes they're called equality or spectrum clubs.
Which is even that is a turn of language, because they used to be gay straight alliance clubs. And now they've just completely co-opted even that terminology.
But those are really indoctrination centers. I talked to someone from Wolf, the
Women's Liberation Front.
Thank you, Women's Liberation Front. And I talked to her about what was going on with GSAs, and she was so angry. She said, when we started talking about having GSA clubs in school, it was to support gay kids so that they would have a social system. And she said, we asked, is this going to turn into recruiting? And we were laughed at, and we were told we were ridiculous. And now that's exactly what's happening. There's a video of a school counselor who is talking to other counselors and teachers about how to start GSA clubs. And she says, we poach the kids from the counseling department.
Oh my
There's
gosh.
a parent in a district near me who is invited to a meeting on equity, diversity and inclusion. And she said she was horrified that the teacher who was leading this said, oh, if you want to get kids for the GSA club, go to the lunchroom and find out which kids are sitting alone and go sit with them and talk to them because they need somebody. And you talk to these kids who are detransitioners and desisters, and they'll tell you, I didn't have a friend group. And they invited me to the GSA club, and suddenly I had a friend group. And it's this love bombing. That's what happens when they go to the GSA club. They're love bombed, which is the first thing cults do. Find somebody who's in a vulnerable state and just love on them. You're wonderful. We're your people. Come be with us. But then the next step is to start separating them, separate them from the people who would protect them. And that's exactly what's being taught in the GSA clubs, is if your parents don't agree with this, they're toxic. They're bad for you. You need to get away from them.
And yeah, they don't love you, and you can go find a family that will love you and friends that will love you. So there's actually been instances where kids are encouraged to run away from home, which just puts them in such a dangerous position. That is not something that a healthy belief system encourages.
No. And I had a conversation with a man here in my district. He teaches in a neighboring district, and he was at a school board meeting that I was at on transgender policy, and he's a trans rights activist and a high school teacher. And he told me at this meeting, I shouldn't tell you this because we're not supposed to do this, but if I find out that a kid doesn't feel safe at home, I help him find someplace else to live. And you help him become a runaway.
Right. Teachers helping kids to run away. I can't imagine anything. I mean, it's and that's, again, these are these extreme belief systems, and they're so convinced that they are the right way that they're willing to put kids in incredibly risky situations in order to further this ideology.
Because we know the statistics on runaway kids. It's not good. Kids don't run away and then go find a happy life somewhere else most of the time. They end up on the street. They end up being trafficked. They end up on drugs. They end up dead and homeless. That's generally the path for kids who run
Well,
away.
and what it also does is it enforces the dependency upon those in this ideology, because once you run away from home, you are now completely at the mercy of the other people who are part of this ideology. And if you decide that you don't buy into it anymore, boy, are you alone.
hmm Yeah, we hear that from detransitioners and desisters all the time, which is one of the other illogical points about transgender ideologies. They say, oh, gender's on a spectrum, and you can flow this way or you can flow this way. But if somebody changes their mind and says, no, I think I actually am my birth sex, oh, that's not permitted. You're out of the group, which is another one of the cultic aspects, is the in group and out of group. And when you look at the way the gender ideology, the gender industry tries to use language like allies. What's an ally? An ally is somebody, it's a military term. It's somebody who is your partner in whatever strategy that you're trying to enact, whether that's, storming a castle, or, taking over another country, or preventing someone from taking over your country. Your allies are the ones who are working with you. Well, the opposite of that is an enemy. There's no middle ground. There's no neutral ground with this. You're either an ally to the transgender ideology or you're an enemy, and that is very cultic. Most religions, they're not considering you an enemy if you don't subscribe to their religion.
And one of the things that I've seen here in my town, and I've seen it kind of played out in other situations, is that allies really have to be at the beck and call of those who are transgender. So there's this pecking order. There's a hierarchy. And if an ally does not do what the trans people tell them to do, or if they do it wrong, they get beaten down. And they get told, you are an oppressor, therefore you need to accommodate us, you need to center us, you need to basically do what we tell you to do. And again, there was a situation in my small town where an ally actually set up a public meeting to celebrate transgenderism, and she didn't do it quite right. She said something that wasn't quite that was somehow like a little bit offensive, and they jumped on her. And she was just completely like, I'm sorry. And so there's a sense of like punishment, and if you do it wrong, then you have to like repent. You have to like confess and repent and make penance, which is straight out of a religious viewpoint. And yet it's a very different one, because in most at least I'm familiar with Christian religions, when you repent and ask for forgiveness, that's granted. But in this ideology, you have to continually prove that you're an ally, and they're on the lookout for you to make one little mistake. And if you make one little mistake, they're going to jump on you. So it's really this culture of fear and culture of intimidation and bullying, which is so ironic, because one of the ways it's gotten into the schools is through anti-bullying, and yet it is one of the most bullying ideologies I've ever come across.
Yeah, they've just changed who the bullies are. That's all. They've made the transgender ideology the bully. And that's also straight out of cults. That's what cults do. They draw you in with love bombing, and then they keep you in with fear and intimidation. And I really see a lot of gang aspects to this as well, because when you talk to the kids who've joined the GSA clubs, once they join the GSA club, and especially if they say that they're transgender, they're untouchable. Nobody can criticize, question anything that they want. And even the teachers and all the adults have to do exactly what they say. Do you remember being 13, 14, 15 years old? That is a heady pill, to know that you have this golden ticket to complete control over everyone around you if you just say you're transgender.
Especially, I'm thinking, because I was one of those kids who would have been very vulnerable to this. I didn't have a lot of friends. I didn't fit in. I was the weird kid. And if I had gone from like being that weird kid who was kind of, ostracized to all of a sudden like being emboldened, like, you call me this. This is my pronoun. I'm going in the men's room. Boy, that would have done some, I mean, it would have gone to my head. I have no doubt. You give a kid who's been struggling all of a sudden power over their parents, their teachers, all the other kids. And if somebody calls them the wrong name or the wrong pronoun, they get to go report it. And they're the victim, and yet they're walking around. And you can see these are not kids who are victims. These are kids who are very empowered with this ideology, and they are just looking for opportunities to get people in trouble. And that's another part of this that's really concerning, is it sort of thought police, word police, speech police, and that indignation, like, Mom, you called me my dead name. And that ability to just sort of have this hatred. And again, in these parent groups that you've talked about, I've seen some posts where, these are parents who are fully bought into the ideology, and they'll post something like, I accidentally called my daughter her dead name. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to make it up to her. Or even parents who've had their children's name tattooed on their bodies, and their children becomes transgender, assumes a new name, and they post pictures of their body and say, what can I do to take this off of my body, because it's my daughter's dead name now. And so it's like, teenagers should not be given this much power in any situation. It's not good for them. They need boundaries.
Nobody should have this.
Yeah, even
Nobody should have
adults.
this much power
Nobody
over
should have this
everybody
much
else.
power. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and there's instances like there's a teacher south of me here in Virginia, Peter Vlaming. He's a French teacher with, I think he's been teaching 25, 30 years. And he had a student who decided to transition genders. And Mr. Vlaming did not refuse to call her, he chose not to use pronouns at all, because he just felt like it was a lie to use the wrong pronoun. But he did not disrespect to this student. He just chose not to use pronouns. Well, there was something going on in the classroom. The student was about to fall, and he said, help her, or something, and the her came out. I mean, he was trying to keep her from being hurt. And he used the her pronoun, which is the correct pronoun, not the preferred pronoun. He's been fired. He was fired for that. She went and reported him and got him fired. There's an ongoing lawsuit right now. We're still waiting to find out what's going to happen there.
Wow.
But when a teenager can get a teacher fired because he accidentally used the wrong pronoun, especially one who was
the correct pronoun.
Right. The correct pronoun, the pronoun she didn't
Wow.
prefer. Yes, for using the correct pronoun. And especially he was obviously not doing it intentionally. That's just wrong. That's insidious.
So are there other of these cult indoctrination techniques that we haven't covered yet?
There's a lot in this book that I'd really love. I really want people to get this book and read it. But kind of, if I can just leave you with one thing, Stephen Hassan talks about the BITE model, BITE, and it's controls that cults use to keep people in and keep them under power of the cult. And BITE stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. And so a cult will use one or more of these techniques. And it really fits with the gender ideology, because the behavior control, what words you're allowed to say, the way you present yourself. I mean, it's very clear that they're buying into the stereotypes, because nobody says, oh, I'm a biological girl, but I think I'm actually a boy, but I'm going to keep dressing like a girl. No, that never happens. They've got to follow the stereotypes. And so there's a lot of behavior controls, like you talked about. You have to say certain things, do certain things, and if you don't, you are punished for not behaving appropriately. Information control. They don't want kids in this ideology, to question it. They don't want to hear that studies are showing that this affirmation only is not healthy. And so they keep those out with the thought stopping processes. thought control, the same thing. You know, don't question these things. Don't ask too many questions. And then the emotional control, I'm immediately drawn to thinking about what they tell parents. Every parent who has dealt with a child with this has heard, do you want a live son or a dead daughter? Do you want a live daughter or a dead son? That's nothing but emotional manipulation. You can't say who's going to commit suicide. And the suicide studies that they cite here are completely bogus. When you look at the methodologies, they are completely bogus. That's just nothing but emotional manipulation.
Well, and it's no different. I often go to this analogy, but for someone to say, do you want a dead child or a heroin addicted child? Do you want a dead child or a child who is, I mean, I'm trying to think of some other really, an anorexic child, sort of this sort of like extremes. You can either have one or the other. There's nothing in between. And to suggest that if parents don't affirm this, that their child will kill themselves. First of all, what is so disturbing to me about that is that it's putting that out there. So kids are hearing this. And so now we're going to have a generation of kids who think that it's a perfectly acceptable response to kill yourself if your parents don't accept your transgender identity.
Or to
Whoa.
threaten to kill yourself to get what you want. You can get
Right.
anything you want if you
Yeah.
threaten to kill yourself.
Yeah, I mean, this is really dangerous. And this again is sort of what defines it as a cult rather than just a belief system. We don't generally have people going around and telling others that they're going to kill themselves if they don't get their way. When that happens, we tend to, you know, put them in a behavior unit and get them help because it's a sign that there's extreme distress. And so this is again a very dangerous indoctrination process, and teaching the kids to use this is going to have long-term repercussions because they're going to learn, oh, if I don't get what I want, this is what I do. It's really, really harmful. So on so many levels, this is different from sort of a typical worldview or ideology or religious belief.
Yeah, and you touched on what I see a lot in this is the false dichotomies. They set up these either or. Well, you either have a dead son or a live daughter. Those are your choices. No, those aren't the only two choices. Recently in my district, there's a group of parents trying to get the schools to open up again. We're still completely virtual here because of the pandemic. And there's a group of parents who are trying to get the school board to open up again. Well, they reported at a school board meeting in a neighboring district, which is fighting the same thing. The school board member said, do you want your child to be alive or educated?
Wow.
How ridiculous is that? Both. Like,
wow.
Ways
Yeah,
that
and that's what I see so often is this, like these extreme, like, you know, and what's shocking to me is in the case of the transgender child, they're threatening, you know, you either have a live son or a dead daughter, but they're not talking about the incredible harms that come from medicalizing these kids. And as it turns out, without being hyperbolic, these kids might not have a full lifespan because of these interventions, because they put them at risk of medical dangers and death. And so looking at, you know, wait, is this really true? You know, am I going to have a live son or dead daughter? Doesn't, you know, when you start kind of digging into that, there's just nothing to back that up. And it's just a way to scare people. Again, this is all about fear and control and indoctrination.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this may be a little bit tangential, but a few years ago, I had a cyst on inside of the knuckle of my finger, and I went to have it removed. And my experience at the hospital, it was like I was going in for open heart surgery. I had all of these forms to fill out, and you could have infection, you could have, you know, all this could happen, this could happen, this could happen. The whole process, I kept going, it's just a cyst in my finger. But it was they even took me into the OR and they like strapped my arm down and they iodined, you know, my entire arm. And I'd look at that and I go, they were so careful to make sure that I knew every single risk of having a cyst removed. And yet these kids are being medicalized willy-nilly. Yeah. They go into Planned Parenthood and they come out with a testosterone syringe, you know. And that's more evidence that this is just an ideology, that this is a cult, that this is not fact-based, this is not reality.
Yeah, it's one of the few medical interventions that if you question it and try to get more information about it, you're called a hater.
Mhm.
So,
Again, the thought stopping. When
yeah,
somebody calls you a name because you've asked a question, you can be pretty sure that you've asked the right question, or
yeah.
you're asking a correct question.
So one of the things that I'm thinking about all this is just we're dealing with something very serious here. These are these techniques, these thought control techniques, and the strategy behind it is very powerful. So how do parents have hope? How do they, you mentioned the first technique where you set up some activities and that you ask questions. Are there any other strategies that parents can use once their kid has sort of been indoctrinated into this?
We don't have a lot of data on this because this is so new, and we are starting to see more and more people detransition. There are more parents who are getting their kids back, but those parents are still very much in the minority. So it's hard to say this is what you need to do. But the parents who are getting their kids back, what we're seeing is they have taken those extreme measures of pulling them out of school. I mean, I was a teacher, and now I am to the place where I cannot tell anybody that I think public school is a safe place for any child.
I have a
Um,
PhD in education, and I feel the same way. I used to be so anti-homeschooling. I wasn't even supportive of charter schools because I thought it was drawing money away from the public school system in a way that wasn't fair. And now, I mean, I have done a 180-degree turnaround on this because I'm seeing what's happening in the schools, and the schools are no longer safe places for our kids, and that just is heartbreaking to me.
yeah, I'm right there with you. I always was, you go to your neighborhood school. Our neighborhood school is a Title I school. My kids were one of the very few white kids in the school, and I felt very strongly. You go to your neighborhood school, you make a community, you live in your community, you don't pull and go, self-segregate. But now I've pulled all of my kids, I'm homeschooling all of them because school is dangerous to children. So taking those drastic measures, we're seeing that that's having an effect, cutting off the trans influences, taking away the internet. My heart breaks for parents who have adult kids who don't have that kind of control. Um, I don't know really what to say other than, get this book or one of Stephen Hassan's books, read it, and start applying some of these techniques. I have reached out to the Freedom of Mind Institute because I'm hoping that maybe they're working in this area and maybe maybe they've got some things in the works for helping people. But we're right on the cusp of trying to figure this out. How are we going to save our kids? But I think number one, you've got to get them out of the influences.
Right. And it is interesting. I'm not sure, how long the COVID crisis is going to go on, but I've heard a number of parents who reported that their children desisted once they were at home. So instead of being at school and being in this kind of broth of indoctrination where, their peers are into it, their teachers are into it, they're getting these special programs introducing it to it. When they closed the schools and kids started staying home, parents reported kids desisting, which is it's such an important information for us to have. It's encouraging to know, okay, so there is something you can do. Unfortunately, pulling a kid out of school and homeschooling them can be really difficult for a lot of people. It's not, but again, this really is such a significant part of your child's life. And as we've seen, when children don't get pulled out of it, when they continue with it, a lot of them end up in really dire consequences. They end up in debt. They keep trying to become more and more like something that they're not. They're running away from themselves. Those underlying issues are not being addressed, and they're not doing well. These kids are not doing well. So it really is worth it.
Yeah. Well, we have a couple of questions from parents. I'll go ahead and read one of those. This is interesting. Why is this ideology so appealing to so many kids?
Well, I can answer that.
Yeah, Yeah, because you know.
Well, I know. I actually, I was sort of, I guess, ahead of the curve on this. I sort of embraced the idea that I was a boy when I was young, and this was way before this whole ideology had even taken hold. And it was a way for me to run away from myself. I had a lot of self-hatred. I didn't want to be me. I didn't like me. I wasn't doing well as me. And saying I was a boy was a way to run away from myself. And so for me, it makes perfect sense why so many kids are doing this. It's a way to become somebody different if you're uncomfortable with who you are. That's what happened when I was a kid. Now it's even like more understandable to me because you have this affirmation, this affection, this, all of a sudden you take a kid who's not very popular and suddenly they're the most popular kid. We mentioned control. All of a sudden these kids have a lot of control. So it's not surprising to me at all that kids are buying into this, and again, kids like to feel like they're part of something. They want to feel part of a group. And this is a group that says, oh, we'll accept you no matter what. Yet that's really not the case. And so it's that false sense of security. We'll be your friends, we'll celebrate you. But it's only under the condition that you buy into this ideology and that you keep progressing further and further down this road.
Yeah. Well, and if you walk down the halls of a school, I went to my kids' high school before I pulled them out, and I just looked around like, how many images are there that are promoting this? And the hallway is covered with posters for, Pride Month, for Transgender Day of Awareness. The school play is about a transgender kid. Almost every classroom has safe space stickers on them. I mean, it's very clear just from the real estate of the halls who's important at school, who's the
Almost
in-group.
surprising that every kid hasn't bought into this. I mean, it's the kids who haven't, there's something, very strong about their character because like you said, it's just being promoted everywhere. And if you're not under that transgender umbrella, on some level, you're suspect, even if you consider yourself an ally. You're not quite really part of the group. So it's not surprising to me that kids who have no inclination in this direction are coming out as non-binary or gender fluid, because that puts them under the umbrella without them really having to change that much.
Yeah.
So it's incredibly, it's shocking to me how much this has infiltrated the schools, and again how kids who aren't buying into this are really being ostracized and bullied.
Mm-hmm. I just can't believe that educators haven't seen this coming, haven't had a moment where they said, wait a minute, this doesn't seem right to me.
Yeah.
What's going on? And unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of educators leaving the system, taking early retirement, because the bullying on to them is, they could lose their jobs if they don't fully buy into this. And again, there's no neutral territory anymore. You can't just say, I'm just going to stay out of this. No, you're an ally or you're an enemy.
You must pick a side. You must pick a side. And I've actually talked to a therapist who fully believes this is a dangerous ideology, and yet he cannot speak openly about it because he will be fired. I actually was going to do an interview with a therapist in another state who was really grappling with whether or not he was had the moral fortitude to stand up for this because he knew what would happen, and he ended up saying that he didn't want the interview. And then I interviewed one person who I did the full interview, and then they asked me to take down the video because of consequences and repercussions. So again, there are people out there who are watching this and they know there's something wrong, but they're afraid to stand up because they will lose their jobs and potentially even more. I mean, when you look at what happened to Ken Zucker, who is a very moderate therapist who on this, and actually is probably more on the gender ideology end of this, but he wasn't buying into it 100%. They went after him, ended up getting him kicked out of his clinic. He was able to sue and ended up winning the lawsuit for slander and libel, but But at the same time, it did happen. His career was attacked, and he again is someone who's very, very moderate in this. And again, he said that up to 60% of the clients in his clinic are medicalized, which means he's more than moderate. He is actually accepted this to a large extent. So it's very scary. But again, there's some things that are worth standing up for. There are some things that are worth those repercussions. And if we don't have people who are willing to make those sacrifices, our kids are going to continue to be harmed.
Yeah, yeah. Well, we've got one more. I think we may have addressed this one already. How do I get my child out of the gender cult?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
again, we're not really qualified to talk about specifically how to do it, because we really don't know. This is so new. We can offer up some techniques and resources, but we're going to have to look back on this in 10 years and figure out what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, I agree.
And that's so hard. And I feel so bad for parents who are in this, because I wish I could just say, you do these 3 steps and your kid's going to be fine. And we just don't know.
Well, there's so much more we could probably say about this, but it's just such a huge, huge issue. But I am fully convinced that transgender ideology is a cult, and it's been intentionally created by the gender industry for profit.
Yeah, and I just encourage parents to look at the resources, and again, just to continue to maintain contact, because I think one of the things that I see is there's sort of like a lifeline, and as long as you can maintain some degree of contact, your child knows that you're there for them. Once that's cut, they're sort of in free fall, and it's so much harder for them to come out of it, because they don't feel like they have a home base. They don't feel like they have anybody they can go to who will accept them if they decide to reject this ideology.
Well, and there's a lot of shame and embarrassment in it too. And this is for anybody, when you have gone whole hog into something, whether that's a cult or whether that's a job or whether that's a romantic relationship, and you've just thrown your entire self into it and told everybody how fantastic it is, and I've found this great thing. And then when it starts to fall apart, there's a lot of shame and embarrassment in admitting you were wrong. So one thing I can say, parents, don't shame your kids. Don't tell them that they're stupid for falling for this. Give them a safe out. You could even tell them a story about when you did something and you were so sure you were right, and then you found out later you were wrong. I mean, be sensitive with how you tell that story. You don't want them to think that you're, trying to proselytize them, but let them know that it's human and it's okay to be wrong, to change your mind, and to be that safe place for them that they can trust that if they do say, you know what, I'm not so sure about this, you're going to be there to welcome them and be a safe place for them to land, and not someone who's going to say, I told you so. I told you this was stupid.
Yeah, that's so important. There needs to be the opportunity to come out of this in a way that saves face and that lets the child know that you still love them and that you've always loved them. So that's a great way to end this. Thank you so much, Maria.
Thanks, Erin. It's always so good to talk to you. Oh, and next time we are going to be talking about dealing with the school. If you have a transgender identified child, how to deal with the school.
Yeah, so if for whatever reason you're not able to take your child out of a school, or if you're just watching this and your kids haven't kind of been indoctrinated yet, you might want to watch the next episode so you know what you're dealing with at the schools.
We are not doctors or therapists. We are not giving medical or psychiatric advice, and we offer no guarantee of outcome. We simply want to talk about how to support and love kids using long understood practices from the fields of psychology, education, and child development. We're glad you joined in our conversation today, and we hope that you took away something you can put in your toolkit for parenting your gender-confused kids with truth and love.